On a rain-soaked night beneath his glass tower, Marcus Wellington offers a pregnant stranger a warm lobby and a dry towel, never suspecting he's just unlocked the vault of his past. One act of mercy will rip open a door he slammed 23 years ago and force him to rethink love, redemption, and what wealth really means. Sometimes the rarest treasure is the one that costs you everything you thought you were. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Wellington's penthouse office like bullets against armor, each drop a reminder of the storm brewing inside his chest. At 52, he had built an empire that stretched across 3 continents, commanded respect from world leaders, and accumulated enough wealth to buy small countries. His name appeared on Forbes lists, his opinions moved markets, and his business decisions affected thousands of employees across dozens of industries. But tonight, as he sat in his mahogany chair worth more than most people's annual salaries, success tasted like ash in his mouth. The amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, a 30-year-old single malt that cost $800 a bottle, caught the city lights below, creating fractured patterns that reminded him of everything he'd shattered to get here. His reflection stared back from the window, a ghost of the man he'd once been. Silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour, Italian suit immaculate even after 14, hours in the office, eyes hollow as the expensive art adorning his walls. He looked like success personified. He felt like failure wrapped in a designer package, like a hollow man wearing the costume of achievement. His fingers traced the edge of a faded photograph hidden beneath quarterly reports that showed record profits he no longer cared about. The picture was creased from years of handling, its edges soft with wear and regret. A young woman with kind green eyes and a radiant smile held a baby wrapped in a pink blanket, both of them glowing with the kind of happiness he'd forgotten existed. The woman's face was turned slightly toward the camera, her expression one of pure, unguarded joy. The baby, his baby, their baby, was maybe 3 months old, with tiny fists and perfect features that already hinted at the beauty she would become. 23 years. 23 years since he'd walked away from the only love that ever mattered, choosing ambition over the family he was too terrified to deserve. 23 years of building a fortune while destroying his soul, of accumulating wealth while losing everything that made wealth meaningful. 23 years of telling himself he'd made the right choice, the smart choice, the choice that would allow him to become the man he was meant to be. He'd been lying to himself every single day. Sarah Coleman. Even thinking her name sent pain shooting through his chest like a physical wound that had never healed, never even scabbed over properly. The ache was as fresh now as it had been the day he'd walked out of her tiny apartment with his suitcase in one hand and his cowardice in the other. She'd been 22 when they met at that coffee shop near NYU, her nose buried in a worn copy of Jane Austen, while steam from her chai latte fogged her glasses. She'd had ink stains on her fingers from the journalism classes she was taking, and her hair had been pulled back in a messy bun that somehow managed to be more beautiful than any carefully styled arrangement he'd ever seen. He'd been 29, already climbing the corporate ladder with ruthless determination, already believing that love was a luxury he couldn't afford if he wanted to achieve everything his ambitious heart demanded. He'd had a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, a master strategy for building the kind of empire that would make him untouchable, unassailable, unforgettable. Love, he'd thought, was for people who lacked the vision to want more from life, who were content with mediocrity and suburban dreams. But Sarah had changed everything with the force of an earthquake reshaping familiar landscape. For 3 beautiful, terrifying years, she'd made him believe he could be more than just another suit chasing money and power through the concrete canyons of Manhattan. She'd shown him quiet Sunday mornings spent reading newspapers in bed, her body warm against his as they shared coffee and dreams. She'd introduced him to homemade dinners that tasted better than any five-star restaurant, to conversations that lasted until dawn about books and movies and the life they'd build together. She'd talked about the children they'd have with such certainty, such joy, that for brief moments he'd actually believed it was possible. She'd painted pictures with words of lazy Saturday mornings with pancakes and cartoons, of little league games and piano, recitals of a life rich in ways that had nothing to do with bank balances or stock portfolios. She'd made him want things he'd never known he was missing, had shown him that success without someone to share it with was just elaborate failure disguised as achievement. Then she'd gotten pregnant, and the walls he'd built around his heart had slammed shut with devastating finality. Marcus took another sip of the scotch that cost more per bottle than Sarah had made in a month at her. Job at the local library. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could afford anything money could buy, but he'd thrown away the only thing that had ever made him truly wealthy. The memory of that last fight still haunted him, played on repeat in his mind during the darkest hours when sleep refused to come and regret kept him company instead. "You're scared," Sarah had said, her hand resting protectively on her still flat belly, tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady with the kind of conviction that came from loving someone enough to call them on their worst impulses. "You're scared of being ordinary, of being tied down, of being responsible for something more important than your next promotion. You're scared that if you choose love, you'll somehow become less than you are instead of more. This isn't about fear," he'd lied, his own voice sharp with the cruelty that comes from knowing someone is absolutely right and hating them for it. "This is about reality. I'm not ready to be a father. I'm not sure I'll ever be ready. And you deserve someone who wants this as much as you do, someone who can give you the kind of life you're dreaming about." "I deserve you," she'd whispered, and the simple truth of it had nearly broken his resolve. "I deserve the man I fell in love with, the one who used to talk about building something beautiful together. I deserve the man who told me that the only success worth having was the kind you could share with the people you loved." But fear had won, as it always did in those days. Fear of mediocrity, fear of failure, fear of loving something so much that losing it would destroy him. Fear of becoming like his own father, who'd worked himself to death trying to provide for a family that needed his presence more than his paychecks. Fear of looking back at 50 and realizing he'd settled for less than his potential, that he'd chosen the easy path instead of the exceptional one. So he'd taken the job in Tokyo, convinced himself it was the smart choice, the practical choice, the choice that would secure his future and allow him to return to Sarah as a man worthy of her love. He'd told himself he could always come back, could always make it right when he was ready, when he'd achieved enough success to feel worthy of the love Sarah offered so freely. He'd been wrong about everything. Success hadn't made him worthy, it had made him hollow. Achievement hadn't prepared him for love. It had taught him to value things that couldn't love him back. Money hadn't bought him happiness. It had purchased the most expensive misery money could buy. The intercom buzzed, jolting him back to the present like a slap across the face. The sound was sharp and insistent, cutting through the melancholy that had settled over him like fog. "Mr. Wellington, building security is on line 3. There's a situation downstairs that requires your attention." Marcus pressed the button with more force than necessary, his platinum wedding ring, worn out of habit rather than sentiment, since his marriage to Victoria had ended in bitter divorce 5 years ago, clicking against the mahogany desk like a tiny bell tolling for relationships that had died from neglect. The ring had been a symbol of his second chance at love, his attempt to build the family he'd thrown away with Sarah. But Victoria had been everything Sarah wasn't. Cold where Sarah was warm, calculating where Sarah was generous, interested in his wealth rather than his heart. Their marriage had lasted 8 years and produced nothing but expensive legal bills and a deeper understanding of how thoroughly he'd ruined his capacity for real intimacy. Victoria had wanted a husband who could provide a certain lifestyle, and he'd wanted a wife who could make him forget Sarah. They'd both gotten exactly what they'd asked for, and it had made them both miserable. "What kind of situation, Janet?" he asked, his voice carrying the weary authority of a man who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives. His assistant's voice carried the careful tone she used when delivering news she knew would displease him, the same tone she'd perfected over 8 years of working for a man who'd built his fortune on the wreckage of his own emotional life. Janet Morrison was 63 years old, had worked for him longer than anyone else in his organization, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his moods and manage his schedule around them. "There's a woman sleeping outside the building entrance, sir. She appears to be pregnant. Security wants to know if they should call the police to have her removed or if there's some other protocol you'd prefer they follow." Through the rain-streaked window, Marcus could barely make out a figure huddled against the building's entrance 40 floors. Below, a small dark shape that looked more like discarded clothing than a human being. Something twisted in his chest, a feeling he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed, clawing its way to the surface with desperate urgency. It demanded attention he didn't want to give, consideration he couldn't afford if he wanted to maintain the careful emotional distance that had served him so well in business. The feeling was familiar and foreign at the same time, like hearing a song you'd loved years ago played in a key that made it almost unrecognizable. It was empathy, he realized with a start. Real, unfiltered concern for another human being's welfare, uncontaminated by considerations of profit or loss, advantage or disadvantage. When was the last time he'd felt that? When was the last time he'd cared about someone's well-being without calculating what was in it for him? "I'll handle it." "Sir, perhaps security should simply call the authorities," Janet suggested, her voice careful but insistent. "I'm sure they can find her appropriate shelter, and you have the Morrison meeting first thing tomorrow morning. You need your rest, and this really isn't the sort of matter that requires your personal attention." Janet was right, of course. Marcus Wellington didn't personally involve himself in building maintenance issues, didn't concern himself with the homeless population that occasionally sought shelter in the doorways of expensive Manhattan real estate. He paid people to handle such inconveniences, maintained a careful buffer between himself and the messiness of real human problems. His time was worth thousands of dollars per hour, literally. His attention was a valuable commodity that he rationed carefully, spending it only on matters that would advance his interests or increase his wealth. But something about this situation felt different, felt personal in a way he couldn't explain, and didn't want to examine too closely. Maybe it was the rain, which reminded him of another night years ago when he'd walked through a storm to catch a flight to Tokyo, leaving behind everything that mattered. Maybe it was the approaching anniversary of the day he'd walked away from Sarah. Maybe it was just the whiskey and the lateness of the hour and the particular melancholy that came with achieving everything you'd ever wanted and finding it wasn't enough. "I said I'll handle it, Janet." The sharp edge in his voice surprised them both. Marcus Wellington was known for his calm, his measured responses, his ability to remain cool under pressure. He didn't snap at employees, didn't let personal emotions affect his professional demeanor. He was a man who'd built his reputation on being unflappable, who'd turned emotional detachment into an art form. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the armor he'd spent decades building felt thin and brittle, ready to crack at the slightest pressure. Tonight, the idea of calling the police to remove a pregnant woman from his doorstep felt like the kind of cruelty he'd spent years telling himself he was above. He grabbed his coat from the Italian leather chair by the door, ignoring Janet's surprised expression as he strode past her mahogany desk, with uncharacteristic urgency. The woman had been his assistant for 8 years, had seen him make decisions that moved markets and destroyed competitors without a flicker of emotion crossing his face. She'd watched him fire hundreds of employees during corporate restructurings, had seen him walk away from deals worth millions because the terms weren't favorable enough. She'd never seen him personally involve himself in anything that didn't directly benefit his bottom line or advance his carefully calculated career trajectory. But she'd also never seen him drunk on regret and loneliness, never seen him vulnerable in the way that only comes when success stops, being enough to fill the emptiness inside. She'd never seen him on the anniversary of the worst decision he'd ever made, when the weight of 23 years of wondering, what if, became too heavy to carry alone. The private elevator felt smaller than usual, each floor counting down like a timer to something he couldn't name, but couldn't escape. The polished steel walls reflected his image back at him from every angle, a successful man in an expensive suit about to do something. Completely out of character, something that made no business sense whatsoever. He looked older than his 52 years, he realized. The stress and loneliness had carved lines around his eyes, had turned his hair silver and put a permanent weariness in his expression that all the money in the world couldn't erase. When the doors opened to the marble lobby with its crystal chandelier and abstract sculptures that cost more than most people's houses, his Italian leather shoes echoed against the floor with a hollow sound that seemed to mock the urgency building in his chest. The lobby was designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind visitors that they were in the presence of serious wealth and power. Tonight, it just felt cold. The security guard, Rodriguez, stood near the glass doors, wringing his hands with obvious distress. Rodriguez was a good man, Marcus knew, had worked the night shift for 12 years without a single complaint or incident. He had 3 daughters and a wife who packed him lunch every day in a paper bag decorated with hearts and smiley faces. Marcus knew these details because he made it his business to know about the people who worked for him. But he'd never actually cared about them as individuals until this moment when caring seemed to matter more than quarterly projections. "Sir, I was just about to call the authorities," Rodriguez said, his accent thick with worry and something that might have been guilt. "She's been out there for maybe 2 hours since the rain started getting heavy. I offered her coffee from the break room, tried to get her to move to the shelter down the street, but she won't budge. Says she's not hurting anyone, just needs to rest for a while." Marcus peered through the glass doors at the huddled figure, and something in his chest clenched tight as a fist. Even from this distance, even in the dim streetlight, he could see she was young, probably early 20s, and obviously pregnant. Her thin jacket provided pitiful protection against the October storm that seemed intent on washing the city clean of its sins. She'd positioned herself in the small alcove created by the building's entrance, trying to find some shelter from the wind and rain, but it was a losing battle. "How long did you say she's been out there?" "About 2 hours, sir. Maybe a little longer. I've been keeping an eye on her, making sure she's okay, but..." Rodriguez trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I mean, I can't just leave her out there in this weather, but I also can't bring her inside without authorization. Company policy, you understand." Marcus understood. He'd written most of those policies himself, designed to protect the building and its wealthy residents from the kind of liability that came with getting involved in other people's problems. Everything was about risk management, about maintaining appropriate boundaries, about protecting assets and avoiding entanglements that could lead to legal complications. But looking at that small figure huddled against the stone facade, all his carefully constructed policies seemed like elaborate justifications for indifference, sophisticated ways of turning away from human suffering because it was inconvenient or potentially costly. "Open the door." Rodriguez hesitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot in the way of a man caught between conflicting loyalties. "Sir, with all due respect, she could be dangerous. We don't know her mental state, her history, whether she's under the influence of anything, and these days you can never be too careful. Maybe we should let the professionals handle this situation. There are protocols for this sort of thing, proper channels. Open it now." The blast of cold October rain hit Marcus like a physical force as he stepped outside into the storm, immediately soaking through his $2,000 suit and expensive leather shoes. The wind whipped around the building's corners with vicious intensity, carrying the smell of wet concrete and urban decay. The woman was curled on her side against the building's stone facade, her thin denim jacket providing pitiful protection against the elements that seemed intent on washing her away. She was young, maybe early 20s, with delicate features that spoke of gentle breeding despite her current circumstances. Her dark hair was plastered to her head by the rain, and even in the dim streetlight, he could see her lips had a blue tinge that made his stomach clench with an emotion he couldn't name but recognized as fear. Her jeans were clean but worn, her sneakers had seen better days, and she clutched a small backpack against her chest, like it contained everything she owned in the world. Which, Marcus realized with a jolt of something that might have been empathy, it probably did. What struck him most, though, was how small she looked. Not just physically small, though she couldn't have been more than 5'4", but small in the way of someone who'd been diminished by circumstances beyond her control, someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible to avoid drawing unwanted attention. She'd made herself as invisible as possible, curled into a tight ball that tried to minimize her presence in a world that clearly had no place for her. "Miss?" His voice came out rougher than intended, gravelly with an emotion he didn't want to examine. "Miss, you can't stay here." She stirred at the sound of his voice, movements sluggish with exhaustion or cold, or both. When she looked up at him through the rain, Marcus felt the world tilt sideways on its axis, felt everything he thought he knew about himself and his carefully ordered life suddenly rearrange itself into an entirely new configuration. Her eyes. Christ almighty, those eyes. Green as bottle glass. The exact shade of seafoam he remembered from a beach vacation he'd taken with Sarah before everything fell apart, before fear had made his choices for him. They were Sarah's eyes, set in a face that was heartbreakingly familiar, yet completely new, like seeing a beloved song performed by a different artist in a way that made you hear it with fresh ears. But this woman was young, maybe 22 or 23, with Sarah's delicate bone structure and that same stubborn set to her jaw. He remembered so well, the same way Sarah had looked at him when she was trying not to cry, trying to be strong, even when her world was crumbling around her, trying to maintain her dignity in the face of abandonment. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable, visible in the arch of her eyebrows, the shape of her mouth, the way she held her head even when she was clearly exhausted and defeated. It was like looking at a ghost, at a memory made flesh, at a possibility he'd destroyed before it could fully form. "I'm sorry," she whispered, struggling to sit up against the unforgiving stone, her movements careful and deliberate in the way of someone who'd learned to be cautious about sudden motions. Her voice was soft, cultured, carrying the remnants of good breeding and education despite her current circumstances. "I'll move. I just needed to rest for a minute. I'm sorry." Her hand instinctively went to her rounded belly. She had to be at least 6 months along, maybe more, and the sight of her protecting her unborn child with that unconscious gesture hit him like a physical blow. There was something so fundamentally maternal about the movement, so instinctively protective, that it made his chest ache with recognition and loss. "When did you last eat?" The question came out before Marcus could stop it, surprising them both with its intensity, with the concern that colored his voice despite his attempts to remain professionally distant. She blinked up at him, confusion replacing the wariness in her expression. Water dripped from her dark lashes, and he could see the exhaustion carved into her young face like lines in marble, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from carrying too much weight for too long. What? Food. When did you last have food? Her silence was answer enough, but the way she unconsciously pressed her hand to her stomach, the slight tremor in her fingers, the hollow look in those two familiar eyes told him everything he needed to know about how long it had been since she'd had a proper meal. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This young woman, pregnant and alone, hadn't eaten in God knows how long. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid for decades, beginning to thaw in the most painful way possible. The ice around his heart built up layer by layer over 23 years of choosing money over, meaning success over soul was starting to melt under the heat of real human connection, real empathy, real concern for someone other than himself. Rodriguez, call Dr. Matthews. Tell him to meet us at the penthouse immediately. Sir, I really don't think this is wise, Rodriguez protested, glancing nervously between Marcus and the woman with the obvious concern of someone who'd seen enough of life to know when his boss was about to make a decision that could have serious consequences. We don't know anything about her, and bringing strangers into your home, especially in her condition, could be legally problematic. Insurance won't cover any incidents, and if something goes wrong. Now, Rodriguez. The security guard reluctantly pulled out his phone, while Marcus crouched down beside the woman, his expensive suit soaking up rainwater from the sidewalk, like some kind of metaphor for the careful barriers he'd built around his life, suddenly becoming permeable. Up close, he could see the exhaustion carved into her young face, the way her clothes hung loose everywhere except around her belly, the translucent quality her skin had taken on from not eating enough for too long. Her hands shook with something that might have been hunger or cold or fear, probably all three, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent wondering where the next meal would come from, where it would be safe to rest, how to protect the life growing inside her when she could barely protect herself. She had the look of someone who'd been running on adrenaline and determination for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to feel safe, to feel secure, to feel like someone cared about her welfare. But it was her eyes that undid him. They held the same mixture of pride and desperation he'd seen in Sarah's the day he left, the same refusal to give up even when giving up would have been easier. The same fierce determination to protect what mattered most, even when everything else was falling apart, even when the world seemed determined to prove that hope was just another word for foolishness. "What's your name?" he asked gently, his voice softer than it had been in years, softer than he'd thought it could still be after decades of corporate negotiations and hostile takeovers. "Emma," she whispered, then seemed to gather herself, straightening her shoulders with visible effort, despite the rain and cold and obvious exhaustion. Emma Sarah Johnson. The second name hit Marcus like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and leaving him gasping like a fish thrown onto dry land. Sarah. She'd named her daughter Sarah. The woman he'd abandoned had named their child after herself, and now that child, his child, dear God, his child, was carrying his grandchild while sleeping in the rain outside the building where he lived in obscene luxury. The irony was so cruel, it would have been funny if it weren't destroying him from the inside out, if it weren't forcing him to confront every choice he'd made in the 23 years since he'd walked away from the only thing that had ever really mattered. Here was his daughter, the baby he'd never held, the child he'd never raised, the woman he'd never had the chance to know. And she was homeless and pregnant and desperate while he lived 40 floors above her in a penthouse that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. Emma, he repeated, tasting the name like wine, like prayer, like the answer to questions he'd been afraid to ask for more than 2 decades. I'm Marcus. Can you stand? She nodded, accepting his hand with trembling fingers that were ice cold despite the relatively mild October weather. Her grip was surprisingly strong, speaking of someone who'd learned to hold on tight to whatever stability she could find in a world that seemed determined to pull the ground out from under her. When she was upright, Marcus could see she was taller than Sarah had been, with longer limbs and a grace that spoke of someone who'd once been well cared for, who'd known better days than sleeping in doorways. He shrugged out of his $2,000 coat without thinking and wrapped it around her shoulders. The gesture was automatic, instinctive, driven by some parental impulse he'd thought had died 23 years ago. The coat dwarfed her small frame, making her look even younger and more vulnerable, like a child playing dress-up in adult clothes. The expensive fabric probably cost more than she'd seen in months, but Marcus found he didn't care about the cashmere getting ruined by rain and sidewalk grime. I don't understand, Emma said as they walked toward the building entrance, her voice barely audible over the rain drumming against the sidewalk and the distant hum of late-night traffic. Why are you helping? Me? You don't even know me? Marcus kept his eyes straight ahead, afraid of what she might see in his face if he looked at her directly. The resemblance was too strong, too obvious to anyone who looked closely. Anyone with eyes could see they were related. The bone structure, the way she carried herself, even the stubborn set of her jaw when she was trying to be brave. The last thing he wanted was to answer questions he wasn't ready to ask, to confront possibilities that terrified him more than any corporate takeover or business merger ever had, because everyone deserves a warm meal and a dry place to sleep, he said carefully, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. It wasn't the truth, not the whole truth anyway. But how do you tell someone that you think you might be their father? That you abandoned their mother 23 years ago because you were too much of a coward to be the man they deserved? That you've spent every day since wondering what happened to the family you walked away from? Wondering if they were happy or sad or struggling or thriving? Wondering if they ever thought about you with anything other than justified hatred? How do you explain that seeing her curled up in that doorway had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead forever, some capacity for love and protection and sacrifice that had been buried under decades of ambition and greed? How do you tell someone that in the space of 5 minutes, they'd managed to crack open a heart that had been sealed shut for more than 2 decades? The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent, except for the soft sounds of Emma's chattering teeth and the whisper of expensive machinery carrying them up through the heart of his steel and glass tower. Marcus found himself stealing glances at her reflection in the polished walls, cataloguing every feature that screamed Wellington with the same methodical attention to detail that had made him successful in business. She had his nose, his hands, even the way she held her shoulders when she was trying to be brave. She also had Sarah's mouth, Sarah's eyebrows, Sarah's way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. She was a perfect blend of both of them, living proof of a love he'd been too scared to claim, too proud to fight for, too young to understand would be the most important thing he'd ever walk away from. Looking at her was like looking at a photograph of everything he'd lost, everything he'd thrown away, everything he'd been too afraid to fight for. She was the child he'd never raised, the daughter he'd never known, the family he'd abandoned before it could even begin to form. And now, here she was, 23 years later, pregnant and homeless and desperate, while he lived in luxury built on the foundation of the very choice that had destroyed them both. When the elevator doors opened to his penthouse, Emma's eyes widened in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. The space was a monument to minimalist luxury, All clean lines, expensive art, and carefully curated emptiness that spoke of a man who'd confused possessions with purpose, acquisition with achievement. 12-foot ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city that never slept. Furniture that cost more than most people made in a year, arranged with museum-like precision. The living room alone was larger than most apartments, furnished with pieces that had been featured in Architectural Digest. A Rothko painting dominated one wall, worth more than most people's houses. Persian rugs covered polished marble floors, and crystal sculptures caught the light from designer fixtures that had been commissioned from artists whose names appeared in museum catalogues. It had taken him years to perfect this environment, stripping away anything that might remind him of warmth, of home, of the messy beauty of real life lived by real people who cared about each other more than they cared about thread counts and market indices. Every piece had been chosen not for comfort or sentiment, but for its ability to impress visitors and reinforce his image as someone who transcended ordinary human needs. The penthouse was a stage set designed to showcase his success, a carefully curated display of wealth and taste that told the world he'd made it, that he'd climbed to the very top of the mountain and could afford to look down on everyone else. Now, seeing it through Emma's eyes, it looked exactly like what it was, a beautiful prison designed to keep out everything that made life worth living. "This is incredible," Emma breathed, then immediately looked embarrassed by her amazement, her cheeks flushing pink with the kind of self-consciousness that came from being acutely aware of the economic gulf between her circumstances and his. Her eyes took in the expensive furnishings, the priceless art, the kind of luxury that most people only saw in magazines or movies. "I mean, it's very nice." "It's cold," Marcus said without thinking, the words slipping out before he could stop them. More honest than anything he'd said in years. The admission surprised him with its truth. For all its beauty and expense, the penthouse had never felt like home. It was impressive, certainly, but it lacked the warmth that came from being shared with people who loved you for who you were, rather than what you could provide. "Sit down, please." Emma perched on the edge of his $15,000 leather sofa like she might need to run at any moment, her backpack clutched in her lap like a shield against the overwhelming luxury surrounding her. The rain had left dark spots on the expensive cushions, but Marcus found he didn't care. For the first time in decades, the welfare of his possessions seemed less important than the welfare of another human being. The contrast was stark and painful, his daughter reduced to homelessness and desperation, sitting in a room that represented more wealth than she could probably comprehend. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had everything money could buy, and she had nothing but the clothes on her back and the life growing inside her. Yet looking at her, Marcus couldn't help but think that she was the wealthy one. She carried herself with a dignity that no amount of money could purchase, a strength that came from surviving circumstances that would have broken weaker people. Marcus disappeared into the kitchen, a space he rarely used despite its professional-grade appliances and Italian marble countertops that had been featured in Architectural Digest. The kitchen was a masterpiece of modern design, with every conceivable convenience and luxury. Yet he found himself rummaging through cabinets he hadn't opened in months, searching for something, anything, that might constitute actual food rather than the artisanal condiments and expensive wines that usually occupied the space. His housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, came twice a week to clean and stock the refrigerator, but her provisions were usually limited to ingredients for elaborate meals that Marcus rarely had time to prepare or appetite to enjoy. He lived mostly on takeout from expensive restaurants, delivered by services that catered to wealthy clients, who valued convenience over everything else. And finally, he located a can of chicken soup that had probably been left by Mrs. Chen, some crackers that were hopefully not stale, and the humbling knowledge that he had no idea how to take care of anyone anymore. His hands shook slightly as he opened the can, the simple domestic task feeling foreign after years of having every meal prepared by someone else, every need anticipated and met by an army of assistants and service providers. When had he last made food for another person? When had he last wanted to? When had he last cared more about someone else's comfort than his own convenience? The questions haunted him as he worked, stirring the soup with movements that felt rusty and unpracticed, like a skill he'd once possessed but had allowed to atrophy through neglect. "Mr. Wellington?" Emma's voice came from the living room, uncertain and small, like someone who'd learned not to ask for too much from a world that had already proven how little it was willing to give. "You really don't have to do this. I can leave as soon as the rain stops. I don't want to be any trouble." The words hit him like a physical blow. She was apologizing for existing, for needing help, for being in a situation that wasn't her fault. She was worried about being trouble, when the real trouble was the world that had failed her, the system that had left a pregnant woman without shelter or support, the father who'd abandoned her before she was even born. "Where will you go?" he called back, stirring the soup on the stove and trying to remember if you were supposed to add water or just heat it straight from the can, feeling like an imposter in his own kitchen. A long pause that seemed to echo with all the uncertainty of a young woman facing an uncertain future, with no safety net, no family support, no backup plan beyond hope and determination. "I'll figure something out. I always do." The simple dignity in her voice nearly broke him. She was so much like Sarah, proud even when she was desperate, strong even when she was breaking, determined to maintain her integrity even when the world seemed designed to strip it away piece by piece. He'd fallen in love with that strength once, and then he'd run from it because he'd been too weak to live up to it, too scared to be worthy of it. "How long have you been on the streets?" he asked, carrying the steaming bowl back to the living room, trying to keep his voice casual despite the way his heart was hammering against his ribs. Emma accepted the soup with grateful hands, inhaling the steam like it was perfume, like it was the most beautiful thing she'd encountered in weeks. Her fingers wrapped around the bowl as if she was afraid it might disappear, and Marcus could see the relief in her shoulders as the warmth began to chase away the chill that had settled into her bones. 3 weeks, she said quietly, taking a careful sip and closing her eyes as if savoring not just the warmth but the simple luxury of having something warm in her stomach. Maybe a month. Time gets fuzzy when you're just trying to survive each day. Marcus felt like he'd been kicked in the stomach. A month. His daughter had been homeless for a month, sleeping in doorways and under bridges, scrounging for food and safety while carrying his grandchild. While he'd been living in luxury, attending board meetings and making deals worth millions, she'd been fighting for survival on the streets of the city where he ruled from his tower in the sky. What happened? She took another sip, and Marcus could see her gathering her strength, deciding how much truth to share with this strange man who'd brought her in from the rain for reasons she couldn't understand. "I lost my job. I was teaching at a private school, 4th grade. But budget cuts hit and they had to let go of all the newer teachers first. Last and tired, first fired, you know. A teacher. His daughter was a teacher, someone who dedicated her life to nurturing young minds, to making the world better one child at a time. The irony was almost too much to bear. She'd chosen a profession dedicated to caring for others, while he'd built his fortune by caring only for himself. "I couldn't make rent after that," Emma continued, her voice steady despite the obvious pain of recounting her circumstances. "Got evicted from my apartment. I tried to find another teaching position, but it's the middle of the school year, and most places aren't hiring. I did some substitute work, but it wasn't enough to get a new place. By the time I found out I was pregnant, I was already behind on everything." Marcus felt like he was drowning in guilt and regret. She'd been thrown out on the street because of budget cuts, because someone in a boardroom somewhere had decided that educating children was less important than profit margins. And now she was pregnant and alone, carrying his grandchild while fighting for survival because the world had failed her and he hadn't been there to catch her when she fell. The father? Emma's laugh was bitter and hollow, the sound of someone who'd learned that not all love stories have happy endings, that not all men live up to their promises when those promises become inconvenient. Gone. He made it very clear that he wasn't interested in being a father when I told him about the baby, said I was trying to trap him, like this was something I planned, like I'd gotten pregnant on purpose to ruin his life. She pressed her hand to her belly protectively, and Marcus could see the fierce love already burning there, the same protective instinct that had driven Sarah to raise Emma alone, rather than settle for a man who didn't want them both. I would never trap anyone. Love should be a choice, not an obligation. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the gut, felt the crushing weight of recognition and self-loathing wash over him like a tide of regret. How many times had he said something similar to Sarah? How many times had he accused her of trying to hold him back, tie him down, keep him from achieving his potential? How many times had he made her feel like their love was a burden instead of a gift? "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. Emma looked up at him with surprise, as if kindness from strangers was so rare she'd stopped expecting it. "It's not your fault. Some people just aren't ready to be parents, I guess." At least he was honest about it instead of pretending and then leaving later. The words hit their target with surgical precision. She was talking about her baby's father, but she might as well have been talking about him, about the choice he'd made 23 years ago when faced with the same news, the same opportunity to step up or run away. The only difference was that he'd been even more cowardly. He'd pretended to care, had made promises he had no intention of keeping, had given Sarah hope before crushing it completely. Marcus turned away, ostensibly to adjust the thermostat, but really to hide the emotion he could feel building behind his eyes. The parallels were too perfect, too cruel to be coincidence. Emma's baby's father had abandoned her the same way he'd abandoned Sarah, had chosen his own convenience over his responsibility to the woman carrying his child. The cycle was repeating itself, and Marcus was forced to watch his own sins played out in his daughter's life. "You don't have to apologize for him," Marcus said quietly. "And you don't have to apologize for needing help. Sometimes the world fails people who deserve better." Emma studied his face with those green eyes that reminded him so painfully of Sarah. "You sound like you. Speak from experience." "Maybe I do." Dr. Matthews arrived as Emma was finishing her soup, the elderly physician looking every bit as disapproving as Marcus had expected. Harold Matthews had been Marcus's personal doctor for 15 years, had seen him through 3 minor heart attacks brought on by stress and overwork, had been the one to tell him his marriage to Victoria was killing him faster than his job ever could. The doctor was a good man, someone who'd gone into medicine for the right reasons and somehow managed to maintain his idealism despite decades of dealing with the wealthy elite who treated their bodies like expensive cars to be maintained rather than temples to be honored. He'd known Marcus long enough to recognize when his patient was doing something completely out of character, and his expression clearly conveyed his confusion about being summoned to tend to a homeless pregnant woman at midnight. "Marcus, what exactly?" Dr. Matthews stopped, short, when he saw Emma on the sofa, now wrapped in one of Marcus's cashmere blankets and looking like a lost child despite her obvious pregnancy. "This is Emma," Marcus said carefully, his voice carrying a warning that made the doctor's eyebrows rise in professional curiosity. "She needs a medical examination. She's been living on the streets, and she's pregnant." Dr. Matthews's professionalism kicked in immediately, his disapproval replaced by medical concern and the kind of focused attention that had made him one of the city's most respected physicians. Of course. Emma, I'm Dr. Matthews. May I examine you to make sure you and the baby are healthy? While the doctor worked, Marcus found himself pacing his living room like a caged animal, his expensive shoes wearing a path in the Persian rug that had cost more than most people's cars. Every few minutes, he'd catch fragments of conversation drifting from the guest bedroom. Emma was about 6.5. Months along, the father wasn't in the picture. She'd been experiencing some cramping but no bleeding. She hadn't had proper nutrition in weeks. Her blood pressure was slightly elevated, but not dangerously so. Each detail felt like another nail in the coffin of his peace of mind. His daughter, and he was becoming more certain with each passing moment that she was his daughter, was carrying his grandchild while living on the streets because some bastard had abandoned her the same way he'd abandoned Sarah. The symmetry was too perfect, too cruel to be coincidence, too much like the universe's way of forcing him to confront every sin he'd ever committed. The irony was devastating. He'd spent 23 years building an empire, accumulating wealth and power beyond most people's wildest dreams. He could buy companies, influence governments, shape markets with a phone call, but he couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the damage he'd done, couldn't give his daughter back the father she deserved, or his grandchild the grandfather who should have been there from the beginning. Mr. Wellington. Dr. Matthews emerged from the guest bedroom 20 minutes later, his expression carefully neutral in the way doctors perfected when delivering news that could go either way. Could I speak with you privately? They stepped into Marcus's study, a room lined with awards and accolades that suddenly felt meaningless, with photographs of him shaking, hands with presidents and prime ministers that documented a life of achievement that felt hollow as papier-mâché. The walls were covered with reminders of everything he'd accomplished, but none of it seemed to matter when faced with what he'd lost, what he'd thrown away, what he'd never even tried to build. She's malnourished and exhausted, but the baby appears healthy, Dr. Matthews said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd delivered too much bad news over the years, who'd learned to be gentle with people's hearts, even when circumstances weren't gentle with their lives. However, she needs proper nutrition, rest, and prenatal care immediately. If she continues living on the streets in her condition, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus understood. His daughter and grandchild were both at risk, both vulnerable to complications that could be avoided with proper care, but could be devastating without it. The thought of losing them, both of having them snatched away just when he'd found them, was more terrifying than any business crisis he'd ever faced. What does she need? Food, vitamins, a warm place to sleep, regular checkups with an obstetrician, someone to make sure she's taking care of herself, because pregnant women living on the streets often prioritize survival over health. The doctor paused, studying Marcus's face with the sharp eyes that had made him one of the city's most respected physicians. "And Marcus, she looks remarkably like you. I couldn't help but notice the resemblance, the bone structure, the eyes, even the way she holds herself when she's trying to be strong. Are you going to tell me what's really going on here?" Marcus turned away, staring out at the city lights that sparkled like diamonds scattered across black velvet, each one representing someone's dreams, someone's struggles, someone's hopes for tomorrow. Somewhere out there were thousands of other people struggling to survive, to make it through another day, to protect the ones they loved from a world that seemed designed to test their resolve at every turn. He'd spent so many years insulated from that reality by wealth and privilege that he'd forgotten it existed, forgotten that success meant nothing if it came at the cost of everything that made life worth living. Looking at those lights now, he didn't see opportunities for expansion or acquisition. He saw them as what they really were, reminders that every single point of light represented a human life, a story, a chance for connection and meaning that couldn't be bought or sold or leveraged into quarterly profits. "Thank you for coming, Doctor." Send your bill to my office." Dr. Matthews nodded, recognizing the dismissal, but not liking it. His expression conveying the frustration of someone who'd spent his career trying to heal not just bodies, but souls. "I left some prenatal vitamins and instructions on the nightstand. Call me if her condition changes, and Marcus, whatever's going on here, don't let pride get in the way of doing the right thing. You've already lost too much to that particular sin." After the doctor left, Marcus found Emma back on the sofa, staring out at the city lights with an expression he couldn't read, but recognized as contemplative, perhaps even peaceful. The color had returned to her cheeks, but she still looked fragile, like something that could shatter if handled roughly. The blanket had slipped down to reveal her profile, and the resemblance to Sarah was so strong it made his chest ache with a pain that was part loss, part regret, part desperate hope. "The doctor says you need rest and proper nutrition," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her with careful deliberation, trying to keep his voice steady despite the way his world was spinning off its axis. "I'd like you to stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out something more permanent." Emma turned to look at him, those green eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him want to confess every sin he'd ever committed, every regret he'd ever carried, every moment of cowardice that had shaped the man he'd become. Why? Such a simple question, such an impossible answer. How do you explain to someone that looking at them makes you feel like you're seeing a ghost, like you're being given a chance to redeem the worst mistake of your life? How do you tell someone that their existence represents both your greatest failure and your only hope for redemption? "Because you remind me of someone I used to know," Marcus said finally, the words feeling like broken glass in his throat, each one cutting him as he spoke it. "Someone I should have taken better care of." "Your wife?" "No," Marcus said quietly, the admission costing him more than he'd expected, more than he'd thought he still had to lose. "Someone I loved, but wasn't brave enough to marry." Emma nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense to her, as if she'd heard this story before in different words, with different details but the same ending. Her expression held no judgment, only a kind of weary understanding that seemed too old for her years. What happened to her? Marcus closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 29 again, standing in Sarah's tiny apartment with a job offer from Tokyo in his hand, and fear eating him alive from the inside out. She'd just told him she was pregnant, her face glowing with a happiness he couldn't understand, couldn't share, couldn't trust to last, when the reality of parenthood set in and made their dreams seem childish and naive. All he could see was the cage closing around him, trapping him in a life of mediocrity and responsibility he wasn't ready for, cutting off his chances to become the man he'd always dreamed of being. He'd been so young, so stupid, so convinced that love and ambition couldn't coexist, that choosing one meant abandoning the other forever. "I left," he said simply, the words falling into the silence like stones into deep water, creating ripples that would spread outward through both their lives in ways he was only beginning to understand. "I thought success was more important than love. I thought I could always go back, could always make it right later when I was ready, when I'd achieved enough to feel worthy of what she was offering me. I thought love would wait for me to grow up. But you couldn't. By the time I realized what I'd lost, she was gone. She'd moved away, changed her name, disappeared so completely it was like she'd never existed." Marcus shrugged, the gesture feeling heavy with 23 years of regret, 23 years of wondering what if, 23 years of success that felt like failure because it had cost him everything that mattered. "I hired investigators, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to find her, but some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Some chances once lost don't come again." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her hand moving in slow circles over her belly in a gesture that was purely unconscious, purely maternal, the kind of instinctive protection that mothers had been offering their unborn children since the beginning of time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but each word landed with the force of revelation. "My mother used to tell me about my father," she said, her words falling into the silence like confessions, like secrets finally ready to be shared. She said he was brilliant and ambitious, but scared of being ordinary. She said he chose success over love because he thought love would make him weak, would hold him back from becoming the man he was meant to be. Marcus's heart stopped beating. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air becoming thick and impossible to breathe. He could hear his pulse in his ears, could feel sweat breaking out on his forehead, despite the air conditioning that kept the penthouse at a perfect 72 degrees year-round. The carefully controlled environment that had insulated him from emotional extremes was no match for the tsunami of recognition and terror washing over him. "She said his name was Marcus," Emma continued, her voice still quiet, but gaining strength with each word. Each revelation that was reshaping both their understanding of who they were and how they'd ended up in this moment. Marcus Wellington. She said he broke her heart, but she never regretted loving him because love gave her the most beautiful thing in her life. Me. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy with the weight of 23 years of separation and loss, 23 years of wondering and hoping and grieving for connections that had been severed before they could fully form. Marcus stared at his daughter. His daughter, Christ, his daughter was sitting in his living room, pregnant and homeless, because he'd been too much of a coward to be the man she deserved for a father. The magnitude of it hit him like a freight train carrying 23 years of accumulated regret. All those years of wondering what had happened to Sarah and their baby, all those sleepless nights spent staring at that faded photograph and imagining the life he'd thrown away, all those moments of success that felt hollow because there was no one who truly mattered to share them with. And here she was, the daughter he'd never known, the family he'd abandoned before it could even begin to form. "Emma," he whispered, her name feeling like prayer, like redemption, like the answer to every question he'd been afraid to ask for more than 2 decades. "I know," she said softly. And when she smiled, he could see Sarah in every line of her face. Could see the woman he'd loved and lost, reflected in the daughter who'd somehow found her way back to him, despite all the walls he'd built, all the distances he'd created, all the ways he'd tried to convince himself that some mistakes were too big to ever be forgiven. "I figured it out when I saw your name on the building directory last week. I wasn't trying to manipulate you or scam you or anything like that. I wanted to see where you lived, what kind of man my father had become." Marcus felt like he was drowning in air, felt like every breath was a struggle against the weight of realization and the terrible, wonderful possibility that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to build something beautiful from the wreckage of his past. "And what did you decide?" Emma studied his face for a long moment, those green eyes seeing too much, understanding too much, carrying a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young, but made perfect sense for someone who'd learned early that life didn't guarantee happy endings, that love was a choice you made every day, regardless of circumstances. "I decided you were probably just as scared now as you were then, but maybe scared for different reasons." Marcus felt tears burning his eyes. When was the last time he'd cried? When was the last time he'd felt anything real enough to warrant tears? Anything powerful enough to break through the emotional armor he'd spent decades perfecting, and had. To look away from the understanding in his daughter's face. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled with 10,000 lights, each one representing someone's dreams, someone's struggles, someone's hopes for tomorrow. But for the first time in 23 years, Marcus wasn't looking at those lights and seeing opportunities for expansion or acquisition. He was seeing them as what they really were, reminders that every single point of light represented a human life, a story, a chance for connection and meaning that couldn't be bought or sold or leveraged into quarterly profits. "Your mother," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't contain, couldn't hide behind corporate doublespeak or carefully practiced presentation skills. "How is she? Is she happy? Did she find someone who could love her the way she deserved?" The silence stretched between them, pregnant with meaning and heavy with the kind of loss that never fully heals, that never stops aching even when you learn to carry it with grace. Marcus knew the answer before Emma spoke. He could see it in the way her shoulders sagged, in the sudden sheen of tears in her eyes, in the way her hand moved protectively to her belly, as if she were trying to shield her unborn child from the pain of loss that was part of the human condition. "She died 2 years ago," Emma said gently, her voice carrying the weight of loss that never fully heals, the kind of grief that becomes part of you, that shapes every breath you take afterward. Cancer. She fought it for 18 months, but in the end, the grief hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over with the force of it, with the crushing realization that all his success, all his wealth, all his carefully accumulated power meant nothing in the face of this simple, devastating truth. Sarah was gone. The woman he'd spent 23 years hoping to find, to apologize to maybe love again, if she could ever find it in her heart to forgive him. She was gone, and he'd never even known she was sick. He'd never had the chance to tell her he was sorry, to explain that leaving her had been the biggest mistake of his life, to beg for a forgiveness he didn't deserve, but needed more than air. He'd never been able to hold her hand during those long months of treatment, never been able to tell her that not a day had passed when he didn't think about her, when he didn't regret the choice that had cost him everything that mattered. "She talked about you sometimes," Emma continued, her voice soft but steady, carrying the kind of strength that came from someone who'd learned to find grace in the midst of loss, who'd discovered that love could survive even death if you carried it carefully enough. Especially near the end, when the morphine made her remember things more clearly than the present. She said she hoped you'd found whatever you were looking for, that you'd found peace. She said she never stopped loving you, but she'd learned to love herself more. Marcus pressed his hands to his face, trying to hold back the sobs that wanted to tear free from his chest, trying to contain the 23 years of regret and loss and desperate longing that Sarah's death had made final and irreversible. "I didn't," he said roughly, his voice muffled by his hands and broken by the weight of truth he'd never admitted to anyone, not even himself. "I didn't find anything worth having. I spent 23 years building an empire that means nothing without someone to share it with. I found success, but I lost everything that mattered. It's not too late." The simple statement hit him with the force of revelation, with the stunning possibility that maybe redemption wasn't just a word people used in church, that maybe second chances weren't just fairy tales told to children who still believed the world was fundamentally good. Marcus looked up at his daughter, his beautiful, brave daughter, who was carrying his grandchild and had somehow found the strength to forgive a father who'd never deserved forgiveness, and saw something he'd forgotten existed. Hope, not the carefully calculated optimism of a businessman projecting future earnings, not the strategic confidence of someone who'd learned to manipulate markets and people to achieve desired outcomes, but real hope. The kind that existed independent of circumstances, that survived disappointment and loss and betrayal, that somehow managed to bloom in the most unlikely places when tended by people who understood that love was always a choice, always a risk, always worth taking despite the possibility of pain. What do you mean? Emma shifted on the sofa, wincing slightly as the baby moved inside her. A small reminder that life continued to grow and change and demand attention even in the midst of revelations that reshaped everything you thought you knew about yourself and your place in the world. I mean, you can't change the past, but you can still choose the future. Mom always said the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him, like tectonic plates realigning after decades of pressure, like the very foundation of his identity was being rebuilt from the ground up. The man who'd built a corporate empire through ruthless calculation and emotional detachment was crumbling, being replaced by someone he barely recognized, someone who cared more about the welfare of his pregnant daughter than his quarterly profit reports. Someone who would give up everything he'd worked for if it meant being the father and grandfather his family deserved. "Emma, I want to be in your life," he said, the words coming out in a rush, tumbling over each other in his desperate need to make her understand that this wasn't pity or guilt or some misguided attempt to assuage his conscience. "In my grandchild's life, if you'll let me. I know I have no right to ask, no reason to expect forgiveness after abandoning you before you were even born, but I was hoping you'd say that," Emma admitted with a small smile that transformed her entire face, that lit her up from the inside in a way that reminded him so powerfully of Sarah, it took his breath away. "Because I have no idea how to raise a baby by myself, and I'm terrified I'm going to mess it up." "You won't," Marcus said with absolute certainty, with the kind of conviction that came from seeing strength and grace and goodness in someone despite circumstances that should have broken them, that would have broken most people. "You're your mother's daughter. You're strong and brave and everything good that I never was." Over the next several hours, as dawn crept across the Manhattan skyline and transformed the city from a glittering jewel into a gray concrete reality, they talked with the intensity of people trying to compress 23 years of separation into a single conversation. Marcus learned that Emma had graduated summa cum laude from college with a degree in elementary education, that she loved old movies and chocolate ice cream and had a laugh that sounded exactly like her mother's. He learned that she'd been reading to her unborn daughter every night, that she'd already picked out names: Sarah Rose if it was a girl, Marcus James if it was a boy. The knowledge that she'd been planning to name a son after him despite never knowing him, despite having every reason to hate him, nearly broke his heart all over again. It spoke to the kind of grace and forgiveness that he'd never deserved, but that Sarah had somehow instilled in their daughter, despite his absence, despite the pain he'd caused, despite every reason she had to raise Emma to despise the father who'd abandoned them both. Emma told him about Sarah's final days, how she'd made her promise to never settle for less than she deserved, to never let fear make her choices for her, to remember that love was always worth the risk, even when it didn't work out the way you hoped. She spoke about her mother with a reverence and affection that made Marcus's chest tight with emotion, with the crushing knowledge of all the moments he'd missed, all the love he'd thrown away, all the ways he'd failed the two most important people in his life. She described the small apartment where they'd lived, how Sarah had worked 2 jobs to put Emma through college, how they'd celebrated every milestone and weathered every storm together. She painted a picture of a life that had been difficult but rich with love, challenging but full of purpose, poor in material terms but wealthy in all the ways that mattered. She never remarried, Emma said softly, her hand resting on her belly as the baby stirred inside her. She dated a few men over the years, good men who would have loved us both. But she said she'd already had the love of her life. She said she couldn't settle for less than extraordinary after experiencing what real love felt like. The words were both a gift and a knife to the heart. Sarah had never stopped loving him, had carried that love for 23 years despite his betrayal, despite his abandonment, despite every reason she had to move on and build a life with someone who deserved her. The knowledge was humbling and devastating in equal measure. As the sun climbed higher and the city awakened around them, Marcus made a series of decisions that would have terrified his younger self, but felt as natural as breathing to the man he was becoming. He called his lawyers and instructed them to begin the process of selling Wellington Enterprises. He contacted his accountant and directed him to establish trust funds for Emma and the baby. He reached out to the city's best obstetrician and arranged for Emma to receive the finest prenatal care available. Most importantly, he looked at his daughter, his beautiful, strong, remarkable daughter, who had somehow found it in her heart to forgive the unforgivable, and made a promise that would define the rest of his life. "I'm going to spend every day I have left trying to be the father you deserved," he said, his voice thick with emotion, but steady with conviction. "I can't change the past, can't undo the damage I've done, can't give you back the childhood you should have had, but I can be here now. I can be the grandfather your daughter deserves. I can try to build something beautiful from the wreckage of what I destroyed." Emma reached across the space between them and took his hand, her fingers warm and strong and real. "That's all anyone can do, Dad. Show up and try to do better." The word "Dad" hit him like lightning, like grace, like the sound of a door opening after being locked for 23 years. In that moment, Marcus Wellington understood what he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing it. Not success or wealth or power or recognition, but this. The simple, profound privilege of being needed by someone who had every reason not to need him. The millionaire had indeed found a pregnant woman sleeping on the street, and what he did had changed her life forever. But more than that, it had changed his, and proved that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't what you build for yourself, but what you rebuild when love gives you the courage to start over, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one heartbeat at a time. The rain that had brought them together had washed away 23 years of separation, and in its place had left something Marcus had thought was lost forever: a family. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the nursery he'd designed himself, watching Emma rock their baby daughter to sleep. The room was nothing like the sterile perfection of the rest of his penthouse. Instead, it was warm and lived in, filled with handmade quilts, stuffed animals, and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes with new life. Soft yellow walls were adorned with Emma's watercolor paintings of fairy tales and nursery rhymes, and a mobile made of paper butterflies cast dancing shadows in the lamplight. Sarah Rose Wellington Johnson had arrived 2 weeks early, during a thunderstorm that reminded Marcus powerfully of the night he'd found Emma sleeping in the rain. The labor had been long and difficult, 22 hours that had tested every nerve in Marcus's body as he held Emma's hand and coached her breathing, praying to a God he'd ignored for decades that both his daughter and granddaughter would survive the ordeal. When Sarah Rose finally made her entrance into the world, she'd done so with a lusty cry that announced her displeasure at being removed from her warm, comfortable home. 7 pounds, 3 ounces of perfect humanity, with Emma's delicate features and Marcus's strong chin, and eyes that shifted between blue and green depending on the light and her mood. "She has your stubbornness," Emma had whispered that first night, exhausted but glowing with new mother's joy as she held her daughter against her chest. "And your determination." She knew exactly when she wanted to be born, and nothing was going to stop her. Marcus had been afraid to hold her at first, this tiny person who represented everything he'd lost and found again. His hands had seemed too big, too clumsy, too tainted by years of choosing money over meaning. But when Emma had placed Sarah Rose in his arms, when those dark eyes had focused on his face with the kind of trust that only babies possessed. Something inside him had clicked into place with an almost audible sound. "Hello, beautiful," he'd whispered, his voice breaking with emotion he couldn't contain. "I'm your grandfather. I know I don't deserve you, but I promise I'm going to love you with everything I have for as long as I live." The baby had made a small sound that might have been agreement, and Marcus had felt his heart complete a circuit that had been broken for 23 years. In that moment, holding his granddaughter while his daughter watched with tears of joy streaming down her face, Marcus had understood what success really meant. Not the accumulation of wealth or power or recognition, but this, the privilege of being trusted with something precious, of being given a chance to love without reservation, of being allowed to build something that would last long after stock portfolios and business empires had turned to dust. Now, 3 months later, Marcus had fully embraced his new role as grandfather, with the same intensity he'd once brought to corporate takeovers. He'd learned to change. Diapers with military precision, to warm bottles to the exact right temperature, to rock a crying baby, to sleep in the early hours of the morning when the world was quiet and full of possibility. His penthouse had been transformed from a sterile showcase of wealth into something that resembled an actual home, complete with baby equipment in every room, and the blessed chaos that came with a household centered around a newborn's needs. Emma had proven to be a natural mother, approaching each challenge with the same calm competence she brought to everything else. She nursed Sarah Rose with quiet confidence, sang lullabies in a voice that reminded Marcus painfully of her mother, and somehow managed to make the sleepless nights and constant demands of new motherhood look effortless. Watching her with the baby, Marcus could see Sarah in every gesture, every expression of fierce maternal love, every moment of patient tenderness. "She's getting so big," Emma said softly, adjusting the blanket around Sarah Rose's sleeping form. At 3 months old, the baby had already developed her own personality, curious about everything, charmed by music and movement, possessed of a smile that could light up the darkest room, and a cry that could wake the dead when she was displeased about something. "She takes after her mother," Marcus replied, settling into the comfortable armchair he'd moved into the nursery so he could spend hours watching his granddaughter sleep, marveling at the perfect miracle of her existence. Strong-willed and beautiful, Emma smiled, the expression soft with contentment and exhaustion in equal measure. Mum would have loved her so much. She always said she couldn't wait to be a grandmother, to spoil someone else's child and then send them home. The mention of Sarah still brought a sharp pang of loss and regret, but it was tempered now by gratitude for the gift she'd left behind. In raising Emma to be the remarkable woman she'd become, in instilling values of forgiveness and grace and unconditional love, Sarah had given Marcus something he'd never deserved but desperately needed: a second chance at being part of a family. "She's here," Marcus said quietly, watching the peaceful rise and fall of Sarah Rose's chest, the way her tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. In Emma's strength, in this baby's smile, in the love that fills this room. She's here in all the ways that matter. Over the following months, Marcus threw himself into the role of family patriarch with the same passion he'd once reserved for building his business empire. He sold Wellington Enterprises to his longtime partner for a fraction of its worth, keeping only enough to ensure Emma and Sarah Rose would never want for anything. The rest he donated to establish the Sarah Coleman Foundation, dedicated to helping pregnant women and single mothers avoid the kind of desperate circumstances that had brought Emma to his doorstep. The foundation became Marcus's new mission, his way of honoring the woman he'd lost and the daughter he'd found. He worked with Emma to design programs that provided not just financial assistance, but comprehensive support, housing, job training, childcare, medical care, counseling. Everything that could make the difference between survival and thriving for women facing difficult circumstances. We want to break the cycle, Emma explained to potential donors and volunteers, her voice carrying the passion of someone who'd lived the reality they were trying to address. Too many women fall through the cracks because they don't have family support, because the system is designed for people who already have resources. We want to be the family for women who don't have one, the safety net for those who've been forgotten. Marcus watched his daughter present their vision to roomfuls of wealthy philanthropists and community leaders, and felt a pride that had nothing to do with profit margins or market share. Emma had inherited his intelligence and determination, but she'd combined it with Sarah's compassion and grace to become something neither of them had been alone, a force for genuine good in the world. The Foundation's first major project was a residential facility for pregnant women and new mothers, a place where they could live safely while getting back on their feet. Emma insisted it be built in the neighborhood where she'd once taught, in a community that had been overlooked by most charitable organizations because it wasn't glamorous enough to attract major donors. "This is where the need is greatest," she said, standing in the empty lot that would become the Sarah Coleman House. "These are the women who slip through every other safety net, who work 2 jobs and still can't afford rent, who love their children fiercely but need help learning how to provide for them." Marcus stood beside his daughter, holding his granddaughter, who was now 8 months old and fascinated by everything around her, and felt something he'd never experienced in 40 years of business success. The deep satisfaction that came from building something that would make the world better for people who needed it most. As Sarah Rose grew from infant to toddler, Marcus discovered joys he'd never known existed. Her first smile had been for him, a gummy grin that had appeared when he'd been making ridiculous faces while changing her diaper. Her first word had been "Papa," which had reduced him to tears of joy right there in the middle of his study. Her first steps had been toward him as he sat on the floor of the nursery, arms outstretched, calling her name with the kind of enthusiasm he'd once reserved for closing million-dollar deals. Every milestone was a gift, every moment of connection a reminder of what he'd missed with Emma and what he was. Determined not to miss with Sarah Rose, he attended every pediatrician appointment, documented every developmental leap, and filled dozens of photo albums with pictures of a little girl who looked at him like he hung the moon and stars. "She has you wrapped around her little finger," Emma teased one afternoon, watching Marcus carefully cut Sarah Rose's sandwich into perfect triangles because she'd recently decided that squares were unacceptable. "Completely," Marcus admitted, without shame. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." The transformation in Marcus was complete and irreversible. The man who'd once measured success in stock prices and quarterly returns now measured it in bedtime stories read, scraped knees, kissed better, and the sound of a child's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. His priorities had been turned completely upside down, and he'd never been happier about anything in his life. 2 years after that rainy night, when he'd found Emma sleeping in his doorway, Marcus stood in the backyard of the house they'd bought together in Connecticut. It was nothing like his Manhattan penthouse, smaller, warmer, filled with the comfortable chaos of family life. The yard was scattered with toys, the kitchen was always full of something delicious Emma was cooking, and every room bore the evidence of a household centered around love rather than status. Sarah Rose, now a walking, talking force of nature at 18 months old, chased butterflies through the garden Emma had planted with the same patient care she brought to everything else. Her dark hair caught the sunlight as she ran, and her laugh, pure joy distilled into sound, rang across the lawn like church bells celebrating the simple miracle of being alive. "Papa! Papa, look!" she called, pointing at a butterfly that had landed on a flower near the garden fence. "Pretty!" Marcus set down the financial reports he'd been half-heartedly reviewing. His consulting work kept him busy enough to feel useful, but left plenty of time for what really mattered, and walked over to admire his granddaughter's discovery. "Very pretty," he agreed, crouching down to her level. "Just like you." Sarah Rose giggled and launched herself into his arms with the complete trust that only children possessed. Marcus caught her easily, swinging her up into the air as she squealed with delight. 2 years ago, he wouldn't have known how to hold a child, wouldn't have understood the fierce protectiveness that came with loving someone so completely you'd die to keep them safe. Now it felt as natural as breathing. "Emma, look at this," he called to his daughter, who was sitting on the porch swing reading a book. She'd gotten her teaching job back and was working on her master's degree in her spare time, proving every day that resilience was hereditary. "I think we have a future botanist on our hands." Future what?" Emma laughed, closing her book and walking over to join them. She was glowing with health and happiness now, all traces of the frightened young woman he'd found sleeping in the rain erased by years of love and security. "Butterfly scientist?" Marcus explained, tickling Sarah Rose until she dissolved into giggles. "She's very observant for her age." "She gets that from you," Emma said, settling onto the grass beside them. "You notice everything." "I'm learning to notice what matters," Marcus corrected, watching his granddaughter chase after another butterfly with the single-minded determination that seemed to be her defining characteristic. "It took me 55 years, but I'm finally learning the difference between seeing and observing, between success and significance." Emma studied his face with the same intensity Sarah Rose brought to her butterfly hunting. "Any regrets?" Marcus considered the question seriously, as he did all questions. From his daughter these days. 3 years of being a father and grandfather had taught him that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, was the foundation of every relationship that mattered. About the years I lost with you and your mother? Every day. About the chances I didn't take, the love I was too scared to claim? Absolutely. He paused, watching Sarah Rose discover a ladybug and immediately begin an animated conversation with it. But regrets about the life we're building now? About choosing family over empire, love over achievement? Never. That evening, after Sarah Rose had been bathed and read to and tucked into her toddler bed with her army of stuffed animals, Marcus and Emma sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their small corner of the world. It was a ritual they'd established in the early days after Sarah Rose's birth, a time for conversation and connection that had become sacred to both of them. "I've been thinking," Emma said, her voice thoughtful in the way that usually preceded important announcements. "About what?" "About Mom. About what she'd think of all this." Emma gestured at the house, the yard, the life they'd built together from the wreckage of the past. "I think she'd be proud, not just of you, but of all of us, of what we've managed to create from such broken beginnings." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever they talked about Sarah, but it was a sweet ache now, tinged with gratitude rather than pure loss. "I hope so. I hope she knows that her daughter grew up to be everything beautiful she ever was, and more." "I want to do something," Emma said suddenly, turning to face him with the determined expression that meant her mind was made up. "I want to expand the foundation, add a scholarship program for children who've aged out of foster care, help them get the education they need to break the cycle of poverty and abandonment." Marcus felt his heart swell. With pride so intense it was almost painful. Of course his daughter would want to take their good fortune and transform it into something that could help others. Of course she would see their happy ending not as a conclusion, but as a beginning, a chance to make sure other children didn't have to grow up without the love and support every child deserved. "The Sarah Coleman Educational Initiative," he said without hesitation. The Sarah Coleman Educational Initiative, Emma agreed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. We could fund it through the consulting business, maybe partner with some of your old corporate contacts, turn all that networking you did over the years into something that actually matters. Consider it done, Marcus said, and meant it. He'd spent decades building wealth for its own sake, accumulating resources without purpose beyond the accumulation itself. The idea of using that wealth to help children like Emma, children who'd been abandoned by fathers too cowardly to stay, too selfish to see what they were throwing away, felt like the most important work he'd ever contemplated. There's something else, Emma said, her voice quieter now. I've been thinking about dating again. Marcus felt a jolt of something that might have been panic if he'd been a different kind of father, the overprotective kind who saw every man as a threat to his daughter's happiness. Instead, he found himself hoping she'd found someone worthy of someone who understood what a gift she was. Tell me about him. Emma smiled, the expression soft and wondering. His name is David. He's a teacher at the school where I work, teaches 3rd grade. He's patient and kind, and he makes me laugh. And Sarah Rose adores him, which you know is the most important test. What does he think about your family situation? About me? He says any man who could inspire the kind of loyalty you do in your daughter and granddaughter must be worth knowing. Emma paused, studying his face. He'd like to meet you, if you're ready for that. Marcus thought about it, surprised to find that the idea didn't terrify him the way it might have once. 3 years of being Emma's father had taught him that love wasn't a finite resource. The more you gave away, the more you had to give. If this David made his daughter happy, if he treated Sarah Rose with kindness, if he understood that he was joining a family rather than taking Emma away from one, then Marcus was prepared to welcome him. Bring him to dinner next Sunday, he said. Let's see if he can survive Sarah Rose's interrogation. She's very protective of her mommy. Emma laughed, the sound carrying across the evening air like music. She gets that from her grandfather. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marcus reflected on the strange turns life could take, the way endings could become beginnings if you were brave enough to let them. 5 years ago, he'd been a successful but empty man, living in a beautiful prison of his own making, convinced that the best parts of his life were behind him. Now he was surrounded by more love than he'd ever thought possible, doing work that mattered, building something that would last long after he was gone. He was learning to be present instead of productive, to measure success in hugs and bedtime stories rather than profit margins and market share. 6 months later, Marcus walked his daughter down the aisle of a small church in Connecticut, Sarah Rose toddling ahead of them as flower girl, scattering petals with the serious concentration of someone who understood the importance of her job. David waited at the altar with tears in his eyes and a smile that lit up his entire face, looking at Emma like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever prayed. The ceremony was simple and beautiful, filled with friends from Emma's school and colleagues from the foundation, people who'd become family through choice and shared purpose. As Marcus placed Emma's hand in David's, he felt a completion that had nothing to do with endings and everything to do with new beginnings. Take care of each other, he whispered to them both, then stepped back to watch his daughter begin a new chapter of her life, one built on love and mutual respect and the kind of partnership he'd been too young and scared to build with Sarah. Sarah Rose claimed her place as the center of attention at the reception, charming everyone with her infectious giggles and determined efforts to dance with anyone who would hold her hands. Marcus watched his granddaughter work the room like a tiny diplomat and felt a pride that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with love. She's going to run the world someday, David said, settling beside Marcus at their table as they watched Sarah Rose convince the band to play her favorite song for the 3rd time. I have no doubt, Marcus replied. "She comes from a long line of strong women who don't take no for an answer." As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Marcus found himself alone on the church steps with Sarah Rose, who had fallen asleep in his arms during the final dance. Emma and David had left for their honeymoon, a week in a cabin in the mountains, the kind of simple, meaningful celebration that suited them perfectly. Looking down at his granddaughter's peaceful face, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility and privilege that came with being trusted with something so precious. In 3 years, this little girl had taught him more about love and purpose than 40 years of business success ever had. She'd shown him that the only wealth that mattered was the kind that grew when you shared it, that the only legacy worth leaving was the one measured in lives touched and hearts changed. "What do you think, little one?" he whispered to the sleeping child, ready to go home. Sarah Rose stirred in his arms, opening sleepy eyes that looked at him with complete trust and unconditional love. "Papa," she mumbled, then settled back against his chest with a contented sigh. Home. The word had taken on new meaning in the past 3 years. It wasn't about square footage or expensive furnishings or prestigious addresses. It was about the people who loved you not for what you could provide, but for who you were, who saw your worst mistakes and chose to forgive them, who trusted you with their hearts despite every reason they had to protect them. The millionaire who'd found a pregnant woman sleeping in the rain had indeed changed her life forever, but in saving her, in claiming his role as father and grandfather, in choosing love over fear and connection over achievement, he'd discovered something far more valuable than all the wealth he'd ever accumulated. He'd found his way home, and in that finding, surrounded by a family built on forgiveness and second chances and the radical act of choosing to love despite disappointment and loss, Marcus Wellington had finally learned what it meant to be truly, genuinely, completely successful. The rain that had brought them together had washed away 23 years of separation and regret. In its place, it had left something Marcus had thought was lost forever: a family, a purpose, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in what we build for ourselves, but in what we're brave enough to rebuild when love gives us the courage to begin again.